Hello, everyone, and welcome to Defense One's Service Spotlight. I'm Sam Scove, staff reporter for Defense One. I'm excited to kick off this series with Major General David Stewart, who leads Pentagon efforts to identify counter-drone weapons. Major General Stewart, thank you for joining us today.
Well, Sam, thank you for having me, and I look forward to a healthy and robust dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, right now I'd say there's never been a more important time for counter-drone efforts than today. There's all sorts of things going on, from Ukraine to the Middle East to Army force design plans that are increasingly emphasizing drones. I think everyone is sort of aware of how important of an issue this is right now. And for better or for worse, we have sort of a live learning opportunity right now in Ukraine and to a degree also in the Middle East, where we're facing attacks there. Um, when you look at the sort of drone threats that we're seeing, what are your biggest takeaways, especially when it comes to, let's say, the mix of platforms that we need to employ?
So, Sam, you've already mentioned the fertile ground and kind of the cutting edge that's happening across the world. So, I would offer that's where we do start. Is we look at all these different conflicts as they're happening, whether in Israel or Ukraine, and then of course our own service members in the Middle East, and we're constantly assessing the threat that is evolving very quickly, and then identifying any potential gaps that we may have, and then looking to demonstrate capabilities to help inform services for their future investment. And all of that process is done in conjunction with the services and their representatives, as well as informed by combatant commanders and their requirements. So that's kind of the overall, but we are consistently looking at all those different conflicts to try and glean those lessons. And so, to answer your question more directly, I think what we've learned is the wide breadth of threats requires a layered and approach, right? So there's a statement that you may hear: "No silver bullets," and most of the leaders in this building, in the Pentagon, recognize that that's true, because when you look at the counter UAS threat, and it goes from groups 1 up through groups 5, each of those provide a unique challenge. And so, while we are mindful and always trying to be a good steward of government funds and spend that money properly and looking for low cost solutions, at the same time, you're going to have some pretty exquisite threats. And as I mentioned earlier, they're evolving very quickly.
And when you look at that sort of that evolution and looking at those other conflicts, there is something unique a little bit about Ukraine or the Middle East, in that they're often static defenses. It's defending a certain point, a certain location, which obviously requires a different weapon. Um, are there sort of balances in the United States Army's traditional use of maneuver forces that will ultimately require a different counter drone design than what we're seeing in Ukraine? Does the way that we fight as an army ultimately have lessons that come to bear on how we design our counter drone defenses?
Yeah, so, Sam, let me provide some context up front, because I am dual headed.
Okay.
I am the director of the Joint Counter UAS Office, and within that role is kind of what I'm speaking to today. But on my other hat, I am the director of what is called DAMO Fires, all things long range precision fires and integrated air and missile defense for the Army specifically. And under that second part of integrated air and missile defense exists counter UAS for the Army. So I can certainly speak to the Army, but I prefer to stick to the joint today.
Sure.
And so there is a debate ongoing about, we have our charter, and it was established back in 2020. And there's always a little bit of a debate on, should our charter be only for installations and static? Should we only be worried about groups 1 and 2 and maybe 3? And what I'd offer, and I think what we found through an organization, is we try to stick to our charter, but with a quickly evolving threat, what I find is you do have static defenses that you have to be mindful of and that are regularly targeted, certainly in the Middle East. But as you mentioned, there's a evolving challenge as we get back to large scale combat operations and multi-domain operations. So maneuver forces, both land forces for the Marines and the Army, but then you also have ships. And I know that the Navy is working to address from their perspective. And so again, more context, I often bifurcate these areas of protection, which I think every service is responsible for, and defense. And so the former, that protection maybe goes up through groups 1, 2, and 3, and the defense maybe extends to the larger UAS of 4, 5, and then you get in even into fixed wing and rotary wing type manned aircraft, and that might fall more into defense realm. So as you mentioned, all services are now working through both static defense of installations, both home and abroad, and then secondly, really trying to work through this second part, which is the defense for maneuver forces. And so I know I went into a lot of context. If you want to hit me back up
Yeah,
with another question.
no, it's there are so many different issues to sort of settle here, and it's all sort of moving at the speed of light. Um, to sort of, I guess, drill down on one example, for instance, just the when we look, for instance, at Ukraine, there's any number of videos of armored columns being taken out by drones. Either it's, you know, a first-person view attack drone that slams into the tank, or it's drone directed artillery fire. And when you look at, you know, how we fight, that's going to be an issue. You're already hearing about folks in JRTC or NTC being, you know, tracked by drones as their columns move into position. Um, is there work ongoing to sort of define the maneuver counter drone problem? And if so, how would you characterize that work?
Absolutely. And so what I found as I came into this position, if you've got a lot of different stakeholders and individuals involved in this space. And so I think that's one of the keys for the JCO is that the SecDef and DepSecDef decided, hey, you know, we got a lot of disparate activity going on. And so we really want to establish an executive agent, which they did in assigning that to the Secretary of the Army, who delegated that down and established the Joint Counter UAS Office in the JCO, which I'm the director of today. And I think what we've also learned is we tend to really focus on the material side of things, but there's a whole tale behind that of whether it's doctrine or logistics and sustainment, policy, all these areas and training is a really large one. And to your point, being able to get the proper training at the right time to then allow service members to go out and leverage the technology that we've provided to them. So specifically about Ukraine, I think you had mentioned, I would offer what you see even on open source is that I really commend all the innovation that you see, whether it's leveraging and learning very quickly a Patriot system for counter TBMs, or then going out and developing new ways of passive detect and leveraging acoustics, let's say, so that you can better detect where the threat is coming from. And then also understanding that at some points you may need a final protective fire, and you may not. The goal is always to try and detect something early and engage it early before it's a threat. But again, with these evolving techniques of the enemy, you're going to see threats that are flying lower, faster, different attack angles. And so there you have to be prepared to go back to what I mentioned earlier, is that layered approach, that not all systems are designed to go after counter UAS or counter small UAS, but sometimes you find yourself defending even those more exquisite systems that are there to defend against TBMs, but those too need defense against smaller drones and other types of threats.
And you mentioned two interesting things that I think are not often talked about that much when it comes to counter drones, which is doctrine and passive detection. I mean, just a squad or a platoon or any military formation needs to know if there's an enemy drone overhead. And one of Ukraine's, or one of the answers that's out there, is more organic detection measures. So you're not waiting for brigade to call down and say, hey, you have a drone. You've got a device that shows you. How do you feel about how important is that passive detection, and where would you like to see joint fielding of those types of systems, let's say in the next couple of years?
Right. I think in the same way that you need multiple shooters, you're going to need multiple sensors. And that's going to be a balance between passive and active. In the end, active sensors are far more capable, but they put out a signature and they make you, and so then you have to decide how survivable you want to be. And so as soon as you illuminate, then you probably are going to want to move. And that's a pretty standard lesson throughout the current conflicts that are ongoing. The other thing is you're going to want to maybe put additional emitters out there to confuse the enemy and maybe oversaturate in some cases, right? So I think in the end, that active detection is still really the highest fidelity and what you would love to have. But as you pointed out, you want to leverage both. And I think we're seeing that certainly in Ukraine. You mentioned doctrine, and I mentioned training earlier as well. And so this is another area that each service is working to wrap their arms around. And the Joint Force, I think, is looking to establish joint doctrine as well. One of the initiatives done in the last year is the Joint Counter UAS University. And so you had a lot of different efforts, and that's at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, underneath the Fire Center of Excellence at Fort Sill. And there you have the home of field artillery and the home of air defense, along with the air and missile defense cross-functional team. So there's a lot of expertise, along with the doctrine writers, a lot of expertise there at Fort Sill in this space. Of course, work still to be done, but that's been a great initiative too, from a training standpoint, to consolidate some of these different programs, bring them under one university. And we've seen really, I don't know the exact numbers, but I do know that it's been about a 50-50 split between joint participants and Army in this case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does seem like the counter drone efforts have sort of accelerated in the last couple of years. Partially, it's obviously a policy thing, and a lot of that is technologies coming online. And I wanted to sort of drill down on some of the tech, with the understanding that there's not a silver bullet. There is still some really interesting work being done with directed energy. It's fascinating too, in that, you know, you're using a system with a theoretical infinite magazine. You're not firing off missiles that then you have to resupply. There is some ongoing work testing directed energy in the Middle East right now. I don't know how much you can speak to that success, but if you could sort of qualify any outcomes from that work, and perhaps more broadly, what the challenges are to actually getting directed energy into the field.
So there's a part of my day that's spent on the problems here and now and helping to inform solutions here and now. And I'm also grateful to my predecessor, who was thinking about this problem set 3 to 5 years ago, that we now have some of the successes that we're seeing in the Middle East, leveraging certain systems against this highly dangerous and evolving threat. But you mentioned specifically directed. And so the other challenge is to look 3 to 5 years out, right? And staying, not just pacing the threat, but outpacing the threat. And that remains a challenge, as you mentioned, because The technology is evolving so quickly. The techniques of an active enemy is evolving very quickly. So we absolutely want to pursue new technologies like directed energy specifically. There's electronic warfare, and then there's kinetic, right? Steel on steel. And each of those have their pros and cons. And we continue to look at each of those type of capabilities and assess where they work really well and maybe where they're better used against a different threat. And so, for example, right now, I think directed energy lasers really good against some of those. And I think we're starting to see some positive effects against the smaller type drones, the groups 1 and 2. The larger and faster something goes, a little tougher to lock onto it and stay locked onto it. And actually, you can do that, but it might take longer to bring that threat down right now. And there's a whole science between the amount of kilowatts you put on something versus the beam detector and the balance of those two. So in other words, what I do know is that more power doesn't always equal better capability. So we are looking at directed energy. I think in the future why that is attractive as well is that while there is some upfront costs and investment required, down the road you could see where there might be some cost savings in the future using technology like directed energy. Then you also talk about electronic warfare, which is another way to get after this threat. And what you find is while it can be very effective and maybe even preferred in certain circumstances, it has its limitations as well. And it can ultimately, or the threat, I should say, can find countermeasures through either hardening or changing their techniques to try and, again, counter where we're trying to outpace, but you always have to. And then the last one is that kinetic, right? The steel on steel. And I would offer, again, a wide breadth of exquisite, more capable, more expensive type projectiles, but down to we're always looking to try and leverage a more affordable projectile. And then where do you find? And then in the end, it really is going to be a commander's call on the ground, understanding everybody would rather take out a threat at 15 kilometers versus waiting until 3 to 5 kilometers or even 2 kilometers. But you want to be able to have that ability.
Right. And understanding all of the sort of technical complexity, for instance, with directed energy weapons, I'm sure there's not a specific year that you can say that will 100% have that, M-SHORAD will be amazing. But is this, do you feel like this is a 2-year problem, a 4-year problem? When sort of do you, at this stage, given that it's already out in the field being tested, are we looking at eventually fielding
I
that?
would offer in my community, we've said we've been 5 years away for 30 years.
Right. Yes.
Right. So
It's a hard problem.
You've probably heard that before. What I'm really encouraged to say is that over the last 5 years, I've seen huge leaps forward. So I won't speculate on the time frame, but as you mentioned, there are some operational assessments going on and testing, and I'm seeing that technology in particular moving in a positive direction. Now, there are some challenges, I think, with the amount of power that you need and how do you keep that system, depending on if it's a mobile system versus a static system, and how do you keep the power generation going to it. I think sustainment, this is really cutting edge capability. So you're going to find that there may be challenges and really it's not mature when it comes from a sustainment perspective, right? So those are some of the limitations of the system. And then, as we mentioned earlier, about different threats and that particular capability based on either range, weather conditions, the threat, and its ability to one way or the other to counter what you're trying to affect it with.
And are you, I'm sure you can't, but are you able to comment at all on what we have seen from those M-SHORAD directed energy tests in Iraq?
Yeah, I think that's better answered by the combatant commander in CENTCOM, because ultimately we'll send a system in at the request of the combatant commander. But I would say the assessment is really done through his feedback to us and to the acquisition folks that are helping with that effort. So I think that would be better answered by a combatant commander, and then of course the acquisition folks. But we're always looking and always, and as I said earlier, I am encouraged that where we were 30 years ago and where we kind of kept moving in a very slow pace and never seeming to make the progress, I've seen really tremendous progress over the last few years.
Hmm. And on the total opposite side, as you sort of referred to, we're also working with, 30 millimeter proximity fused ammunition, which is the complete opposite technological end of lasers. And there was a recent call for proposal that seemed to be a solicitation for um, some sort of maybe counter drone gun truck, like the types that we've sent to Ukraine that I understand to be successful. What are sort of the pros and cons of using those, almost more ancient systems, and do you see that as playing a role for counter UAS, that pure gun truck system or some sort of equivalent?
Yeah, I think, well, first off, I want to mention that, so we work within the JCO to have these demonstrations that are looking at different, pretty specific problem sets over time. And the good news is that every one of our demonstrations has resulted in a capability either going to a service or out to a warfighter. So that's a good news story. From an Army perspective, I can speak to, we are consistently looking at, and especially now that we came through a coin period where we were built to fight in a contingency counterinsurgent
Right.
operations, and now we're looking at large scale combat operations. And so now you have this relatively new threat that's coming. So some of it's, I mean, Hinds and Hips were around forever back in the Cold War, right? But now we have an introduction of these smaller, more agile, and quite frankly, very dangerous UAS that we have to counter. So from the Army perspective, and maybe even from the Marine Corps perspective, from a ground force perspective, you are looking at how am I going to defend, say, a tactical operations center against a larger threat, or how am I going to move forward in a wet gap crossing to defend and help the maneuver force there. And that might be the defense part I was talking about, an actual function done by maybe an air defense soldier. And then you now have the protection part of it, where down to, and from the Army perspective, down to squad level, ensuring that they have the ability to, number one, it be light enough, because every sergeant major is going to ask, well, how much does that thing weigh, right? Because a soldier or a Marine is going to have to carry that equipment. So you want it to be light. You want to have innovative power generation, right? So that's another issue. And you are still trying to detect something. That's probably most important. I want to know something's out there and detect it. And then you can, and then you might also have a way to put effects on it to either spoof it or maybe get it to cut link with the home station, right? So there are lots of different ways to get after that. Or quite frankly, there's a thing called passive defense, and that's cover and concealment. So knowing that, hey, there's a threat out there and I might have to take cover, right? So there are a lot of different ways to get after that threat. But to your point, we are looking at down to squad level, how can we get this capability in the hands of the operator, whether it's a soldier, a Marine, or maybe even special forces operators.
And to that end, I mean, when you look at the the 30 millimeter guns, the types of things that can shred drones. Um, are there systems already out there that you're looking at, or is this a totally novel, we're starting from
Yeah,
scratch?
I think that's a great point. I'm glad you pressed on that because it was one of the points I wanted to bring up is one of the challenges or one of the goals is to leverage current capability and innovation and technology, and then pile on some new technology. And so I think one of the examples of that, and you may see similar technology in Ukraine, we have a system that is called Smart Shooter. And this is basically putting an optic onto a rifle so a soldier, and that's the other thing too, is you want as much as possible, certainly down at that squad level and below, you want it to be uh, skill level and training agnostic to some extent, right? You want to be able to put that in the hands of somebody that has basic soldier skills firing a rifle and then put an optic on top and be able to engage an enemy that's in front of you. But then if you have an overhead enemy, now you have an optical that allows you to engage effectively a drone that's flying overhead. It might be stationary, it might not be. And so we are seeing, again, coupling current technology and leveraging future innovation.
And there in the budget documents for this year, there was a small purchase of anti-drone equipment for the sort of squad and platoon level. I think it was a drone buster. There was the smart shooter
Yep.
optic. The one question I had about it though was that the I think in total it was about 60 systems for a division, which certainly seems too small if you look at the how Ukraine has worked, where they're using thousands and thousands of squad level weapons. Um, to the degree that you can speak on it, is that quantity of 60 systems, is that an initial starting point for divisions? Would you like to see more? Because it on a sort of just comparison level, it doesn't seem like enough.
I, I would directly, I would tell you, I think that is a starting position. And I think
Mm.
the Army, and from an Army perspective, and quite frankly, I think all the services are looking at how they're going to approach this protection aspect. What I do know as a career air defender, you're never going to have enough. And so, in the same way that uh, for the Patriot Force, let's say, you have a critical asset list. Well, that is further refined into a defended asset list. And that's just a process of a commander saying, I've got all these things I want to defend. I really have to prioritize them because I'm not going to have enough to defend everything. And so this is the challenge of, when you start trying to get down to squad and below, when did a mortarman stop being an infantryman, right? And you might have the same question here. When do we all, and when there's a common in the Army, we all become infantrymen at some point. Well, maybe we all become air defenders at some point too, right? And be able to have to go between those two. So yeah, I think it's a starting point. I think most services and service chiefs, I won't speak for them, but I would tell you that the topic of capacity is a common theme. And I think that that's an area where we're going to see the department really work. And that's everything from squad level and below to ships to defending air bases and everything in between. So I would tell you, and then budget wise, I would just offer that every service is going to figure out what they require to get after their missions. And they're going to have to make difficult choices and prioritize how they want to spend their budget. And I would tell you that you're going to always have some services that invest more in RDT&E and research development and test and evaluation, and then procurement dollars, right? And so you've got different levels, and that comes from aligning with the overall national strategy, right? And then figuring out what your service is intended to do. And so I think that's a process that all service chiefs
Right.
and their staffs are working through. And we're here to help inform through what do we see as the threats out there, and what do you see as the threats that we might be able to identify gaps, and then go through these demonstrations and present to you what we think are best practices or best systems that we'd recommend that you put your resources against.
Right. And so, it is always a resource constrained atmosphere, but as you develop the doctrine, if you had, unlimited money, could you see a world where, every squad or every platoon has some sort of counter drone capability? Again, if money is no limiting factor.
In my estimate, I think that's where we're headed.
Mhm.
Understanding that you're never going to have enough, and at some point you might have to reallocate based on mission. You might have to reallocate based on where you are in a readiness cycle, based on what the threat is and where you are. So, in my estimation, yeah, I think we're going to see at the squadron level below and the smaller, I think you are going to see a proliferation of this type of technology to allow individuals and smaller groups to protect themselves. At the same time, you're going to still have to make difficult decisions, budgetary decisions, on some of those more exquisite capabilities. And again, what is your service? This is a philosophical discussion too. What is your service meant to do? What is your prime mission? And those are the decisions that service chiefs obviously will make.
Yeah, it's an interesting environment to be in. Looking out to the next 6 months, next year, there's a major drone swarming test, I believe, sometime this summer. Is there anything else that you're sort of looking towards to test and to evaluate?
So thanks for bringing that up. It is our fifth demonstration, and it is designed against and to counter swarm activity. And then we're still, I think, as a community, working through what is mass attack, which is really the kitchen sink coming at you, versus what is a swarm, where maybe there's communication between the two and they can act in some autonomous fashion or change mission as needed. And so this is really when you're talking about within the next 6 months, we're going to do a demonstration against that. We're looking at, and it goes back to being able to, in some cases, detect it, to track it, identify, and by it I mean the threat target. And then at some point, in some cases, we're going to work to defeat, or in other cases, just be able to demonstrate the front end of what I just talked about. But everything from drone on drone, looking at multi-mission radars. I think that's another thing, right? Is you want to leverage all the sensors that you have out there that maybe they're not just intended for one threat, but they can help you with multiple threats, and then also contribute to both defensive and offensive type fires.
You're talking about like a land-based radar that could sort of identify incoming drones and also maybe pick out counter battery artillery fire targets.
Well, that's right. Yeah, exactly. And I think that is exactly where we want to go. And to my earlier point, once you expose yourself, chances are you want to move, right? Because the enemy has the same capability, and it's really a process of intertwining those two. And again, as a lifelong air defender, you only want to block so long before you take a punch, right? And so that would be my thought. But there's always a balance there, and helping those two that years ago might have been different missions, but finding the common ground, and maybe it's through sensors, maybe it's through command and control systems, and ensuring that you're leveraging that, because again, speed matters.
Yeah, part of that concept, just so I understand, is the idea that an army formation or any unit doesn't necessarily want to lug around a counter battery radar and an air defense radar and a bunch of other stuff, right?
Yeah. In the same way that a in the same way that a sergeant major is going to ask about how heavy it is, the senior leaders within all services are going to want to know, well, gosh, what size aircraft can I put that in, right? And how many pieces are there that go with that? And so you're right; those are considerations.
Yeah, it's the devil is always in that logistic pipeline. I wish we could keep talking for a number more hours, but unfortunately we have to cut it short. Um, Thank you so much for joining us, Major General Stewart. It's been a pleasure talking with you today.
Well, Sam, thank you, and I really appreciate the opportunity and your efforts to highlight this really dangerous and, as we pointed out, an evolving threat. So, thank you again for your questions and again shedding light on what is a problem that's not going anywhere anytime soon.
Absolutely. And to our viewers, in the coming weeks, we will continue our Spotlight series by sitting down with Brigadier General Shipley, Deputy Commander of U.S. Marine Corps Pacific, and Vice Admiral Ashbeck, the Commander of U.S. Navy's Information Forces. We look forward to seeing you there. For Defense One, I'm Sam Scove. Thank you all.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. I'm Anna Pettyjohn, Executive Vice President of GovExec, and I'm excited to continue today's conversation alongside today's underwriter, Dell Technologies. Joining me, I have Daryl Reimel, Enterprise Architect with Strategic Programs at Dell Technologies. Daryl, it's great to have you here with me. Thanks so much for joining. Let's jump right in. So to kind of set the stage, I would love for you to kind of give an overview of what is the tactical edge.
Well, thanks for having me today. The tactical edge. Well, the tactical edge. It's generally difficult to discuss because it's something different to everyone. It could be a drone, could be a ship, could be a soldier, right? The tactical edge. It's relevant to a relevant term to the mission. So the edge is obviously not limited to DoD, and that's why I find the edge personally so interesting. So let's talk a little bit briefly about the challenges of the edge. If we had a mini containerized data center everywhere, right, with unlimited bandwidth, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation, because that's what makes the edge so unique. It operates in these really austere environments, right? And it's regardless of the vertical that you operate in, could be oil and gas, utilities, telco, DoD. I mean, the goal is the same, right? It's to move the processing as far from the data center as possible. I mean, that's the key to this, right? And we could be talking about, an HVAC system, or we could be talking about a disparate sensor on an ISR platform. I mean, they're all attempting to do the same thing. It's processing the data as far away from the data center as possible. You want to make that information consumable to the operator quickly, and with the limited bandwidth that's available. So that's what makes the edge so interesting, right? Because we're pushing technology further from the data center, but the challenges become exponentially harder to deal with as you get closer to the tactical edge, right? I mean, you have environmental concerns, power, lack of resources, and most importantly, I mentioned earlier, the networking challenges. And the interesting thing is you could have this same conversation with different verticals, right? You could have this conversation with telco, utility, DoD, and it's fundamentally going to run into the same obstacles, right? I mean, you're just looking at it through a different lens. That's what's so interesting. And I'll give you a perfect example, right? Acoustics. You have acoustics in a platform. So you have a soldier sitting in a shelter, right? And obviously acoustics are important. They can't run with headphones on, but you'll see similar challenges like with acoustics in telco, right? Let's think of a remote station that disturbs wildlife, and they have to take those same considerations in, and so you're running into these same problems, right? The problem set stays the same. But to get back on to why we're here, the tactical edge, right? Let's talk more about that. It's not really a new concept. It's been around for about 30 years. I mean, at least 30 years that I can remember. So I probably date myself a little there, but it's been around a while. Since its inception, right, it's really been there to serve one purpose, and that's to provide reliable and intelligent data to the warfighter. If you look back at the early days, like FBCB2 and Army Battle Command Systems, right, their fundamental focus was the same as today. It was to process data at the edge, and while they were mostly manual processes, it was still there to provide valuable information to the warfighter. So, what we're trying to do today at the edge is, similar to the past. We want to prevent large amounts of data from having to traverse these limited networks back to a central data center for processing. I mean, I use data center loosely. We could be talking about a corps, a division, a brigade, battalion. Um, you know, we really want that collection of computational power to work for the commander, right? It's sensors and weapons. You know, we're using Dell servers and edge gateways to, you know, collect this data as close as possible to the edge, right? So we're trying to make data available for consumption for the weapon systems, you know, in near real time, right? And we're doing this in a DDIL environment, right? A disrupted, disconnected, intermittent, low bandwidth environment. And the real challenge with the edge is always going to be the network, always has been the network. So that's what really forces this computational power to the edge. And you know, one thing I'll finish up this with is that, you know, a lot of folks confuse edge with IoT, and they're not the same things, right? Tactical edge wants to bring the computational power to the platform, where, you know, IoT devices are generally less compute intensive and they're designed to bring data back to the cloud. So I wanted to draw a line there because you know, we really need to make sure that when we have these conversations, we're talking about, you know, the computational challenges that soldiers have at the edge, not, you know, how we're going to move our Google Map data up to the cloud, right? It's not the same. So I know it may not answer your question exactly, but, you know, it's a very difficult topic to quantify.
So you touched on this briefly, but how has the edge become so critical to executing DoD missions?
Well, as I previously mentioned, the edge is not a new concept. That being said, the edge is becoming increasingly more important. Weapon systems, sensors, even background processes such as network monitoring tools, cybersecurity tools, they all generate massive amounts of data, right? Trying to package this data up and moving it back to central data center again is, and I use data center generically, right? Could be a TOC, could be an ISR platform. It's very difficult. I mean, even with pristine bandwidth, it's hard. I mean, you know, we get, as I mentioned earlier, the limiting factors of DDIL environments. They emphasize that computing need at the edge, and you know, during a conflict, these pipes are not going to be there to push that data back to a cloud. So, you know, and also you have to take into consideration the time it takes to set up an environment that can, you know, process and move data back to a cloud. Right? It's just not practical at the edge. So computational power at the edge, I mean, it's the key to dominating the digital battlefield. It really is. Commanders need to make decisions quickly. Data needs to be available for these decisions to be made accurately. Having that data available on the move or in near real time is what makes the edge processing critical. And you know, given the explosion of artificial intelligence, and I'm not trying to toss buzzwords out here, I'm really not, but it's a real factor, right? I mean, as we rely on AI technology to inform our decisions, the critical need just grows. The amount of data that will need to be processed to make AI a reality to the warfighter, it's only going to grow exponentially, right? It's going to fuel the need to continue to evolve these edge capabilities.
Daryl, what kind of edge requirements are you seeing today?
Again, that's a difficult question because it really depends on what we're solving for. They're always constants, and that being size, weight, and power. You know, we want to package as much compute into these purpose-built kits and platforms as possible. And generally, all edge requirements start from SWaP. Dell has been leading the industry in building edge products at scale for many years, and designing both hardware and software that will support edge computing requirements is a core capability. Something we've really focused on since we released our rugged laptops years ago, and then evolved into our servers and gateways. But aside from the hardware requirements, we need to plan for products that really support the hybrid and multi-cloud environments. And I bring that up for a reason. While the edge is focused heavily on local processing, at some point, that data has to be moved up into a higher echelon for further processing or just distribution to, you know, to other echelons, be it core division. And there's complexity in moving data through the battlefield, but you know, it is still a necessity and it's a requirement. So, you know, building systems that leverage both heavy computational power at the edge, maintaining SWaP, but also giving you the capability of, you know, leveraging the hybrid or multi-cloud environment is key. And security, right? Security is a huge requirement. requirements are shifting increasingly towards maintaining levels of security that, a decade ago were unthought of. Security requirements, they're just extending past our traditional boundaries as well. We're not talking about someone or a soldier just accessing data anymore, right? We're talking about, where did these components come from? What was the supply chain? Is it secure? Are the underlying components that manage the hardware and software, they secure? So the requirements are complex. And, when you factor in the challenges that come with these austere environments, it continually forces us to evolve our thinking and how we support the DoD and their requirements. And that is at the heart of Dell's capabilities.
I'm going to be a little bit forward looking for our last question. Daryl, what is the future of the tactical edge?
Tactical edge will continue to grow. There's really no chance that it will decelerate. And it's going to grow exponentially as we unlock the power of AI. The easy answer is to say that the future is going to be size, weight, and power, because, as I mentioned earlier, it's size, weight, and power are always a concern. It's obviously more CPU, less power draw, all in a small form factor, right? Those are the future, but that's what's right in front of us, right? There's other things that the edge is gonna need, and don't get me wrong, Dell is designs around these requirements, but the reality is the key to the edge's future will be designing systems that can be quickly provisioned. Unlike a data center where we can add more computers to solve problems, the environment at the tactical edge is finite, and we have to use all the resources that are available and dynamically adjust these workloads. We have to look at things like distributed computing. The future will need to leverage all compute systems that are available dynamically. We have to move away from the siloed designs and work towards a tactical edge that is adaptable. It has to be adaptable for the soldier, right? To get back to what I previously stated, that, we can't look at trying to solve one problem. These computers are going to have to solve many problems all at once. And the future is also going to embrace zero trust. It's going to be a huge part of the environment. Our adversaries are going to look to exploit these ISR platforms, right? These drones, the weapon systems. So zero trust is going to be key in the future. And to finish it up, we have to be able to process data securely. I mean, that's security, in my opinion, above everything else, will be paramount to the future.
Daryl, that's really helpful. And I think you provided a lot of great insights in a short session. So thank you so much for being here with us today. And thank you to Dell Technologies for supporting today's conversation and making today's event possible. Lastly, I want to thank our audience for tuning in. Keep an eye on your inbox for a link to the on-demand program from today. And please feel free to share with your colleagues who might not have been able to attend. From GovExec, I'm Anna Pettyjohn. Have a great day.